They say you never truly know a person until you witness the moment their mask slips. For me, that moment didn't come with a shout or a slammed door. It came on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in late October, riding the hollow static of a smartphone speaker. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 60 years old, and for over 3 decades, my hands were steady in the sterile corridors of St. Jude's Hospital in Portland as a head nurse. I spent 35 years stitching up lacerations, monitoring flat lines, and comforting grieving families. I was trained to diagnose trauma from a single glance, to remain unshakable under pressure, and to carry the weight of other people's emergencies without breaking. Yet all those years of medical training completely failed to prepare me for the quiet devastation unfolding in my own backyard. My sanctuary has always been my home in the Oregon foothills, a timber-framed house surrounded by evergreens and rows of English lavender I tend by hand. On that Tuesday, the air carried the sharp scent of incoming frost. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across my porch as I knelt in the dirt, trimming the heavy purple stalks before winter. The only sounds were pine needles brushing against the roof and the distant caw of crows over the ridge. It was a grounding routine. Then, the world shattered with a single jarring buzz vibrating from the pocket of my fleece jacket resting on the porch rail. I paused, wiping a smudge of damp soil from my thumb, and pulled the phone out. The screen illuminated with a name that had once brought me genuine paternal pride: Julian, my son-in-law. Julian Callahan, a man gifted with the rare, dangerous kind of effortless charisma that instantly disarms a room. Tall, impeccably groomed, with an easy smile that could charm anyone from a bank loan officer to a skeptical old nurse like me. When he married my only daughter, Sarah, 5 years ago, I felt a profound sense of relief. Sarah was a quiet, deeply empathetic high school English teacher, prone to carrying everyone else's burdens. I looked at Julian and thought he was the bright, protective anchor she needed. I welcomed him into my home and trusted him like my own blood. I swiped the screen, answering with a warm inquiry about his family, only to be met with a heavy, ragged intake of breath. The familiar, radiant confidence in his voice was completely gone, replaced with a hollow, broken tremor that signaled absolute defeat. He did not call me Mom or address me with casual warmth. Instead, he whispered my name with a choked sob, confessing that his health tech startup had completely collapsed, that the banks had frozen his corporate accounts, and that federal bankruptcy trustees were on the verge of liquidating his entire life's work by the following morning. He unspooled a harrowing tale of desperation, of driving an Uber downtown through the midnight hours just to scrape together grocery money for Sarah and the boys, his hands shaking so violently on the steering wheel that he felt like a total failure as a husband and a father. Every defensive barrier I had built over a lifetime in emergency medicine dissolved instantly at the sound of that familiar, crushing despair. When I finally asked him what it would take to keep the doors open, his voice dropped to a trembling, broken whisper. $75,000. The number hit me like a physical blow to the chest. $75,000? That wasn't spare change or a casual family loan. That was the core of my retirement savings. Every single dollar I had set aside during 35 years of grueling 12-hour night shifts and standing on my feet until my joints ached.
He babbled quickly through his tears, calling it a mere bridge loan tied to an imminent hospital acquisition contract in Seattle, swearing on his life and, most sacredly, swearing on the heads of my two little grandsons, Leo and Toby, that every penny would be returned by the first winter frost. In our family, swearing on a child's life was an unwritten sacred oath no decent human would ever break. My mind screamed at me to pause, to call Sarah, to demand a formal contract, but his performance of a broken, protective father completely short-circuited my professional skepticism.
When I finally yielded and agreed to help, his frantic desperation instantly vanished into a wave of triumphant theatrical relief. He thanked me profusely before slipping in one final calculated request to keep the transaction entirely between us for a little while, pleading that my proud, overworked daughter would worry herself sick if she knew how deep his financial troubles ran. It sounded noble. God help me, I bought every single word of it. The next morning at 9 a.m., I stood inside the polished marble lobby of the First Oregon Community Bank. I watched the teller methodically type the numbers into her terminal, confirming the wire transfer of $75,000 from my personal savings account directly to Julian Callahan's corporate account. I signed my signature on the digital pad, watching my hand tremble slightly as the green checkmark flashed. As I walked out into the bright sunlight, clutching the white paper receipt in my palm, a cold dread settled deep into my bones. I felt as though I had handed away the armor of my entire life to a stranger. 2 months slipped by in a fragile manufactured peace. To the outside world, life resumed its steady rhythm, lulling me into a false sense of security that now makes my stomach turn. Every Sunday, my daughter Sarah would call me from her kitchen, her voice bright and unburdened as she chatted about her high school students, lesson plans, and the simple, ordinary chaos of raising two active boys. She never mentioned money, and she never hinted at trouble. Hearing her relaxed, cheerful tone week after week acted like a soothing balm on my anxieties. It convinced me that my decision had been the right one, that Julian had weathered his crisis, stabilized his startup, and put his financial nightmare firmly behind him. I allowed myself to believe the heavy transaction I made at the bank was already fading into the past, a closed chapter of family sacrifice that had successfully saved my daughter from unnecessary stress. Then, a heavy, cream-colored invitation arrived in my mail slot, embossed with shimmering gold lettering. It was a formal invitation from Julian, inviting me to an exclusive celebration dinner hosted at a high-end glass-walled resort restaurant overlooking the glittering expanse of the bay outside the city limits. The occasion was billed as a major milestone gala, a private gathering to celebrate his health tech firm officially securing a multi-million-dollar acquisition contract with a major regional network. The card promised an evening of fine dining, high-profile investors, and a toast to new beginnings. That Saturday evening, I carefully dressed in my finest navy silk dress, pinned a modest silver brooch to my collar, and drove my sedan out to the resort. The venue was breathtaking, perched dramatically on a jagged cliffside, where the amber lights of the outdoor terrace reflected off the dark, churning water below. Valet attendants parked luxury sedans in neat rows, and the crisp evening air carried the murmur of expensive laughter, clinking crystal and soft jazz drifting from the patio. Stepping through the glass double doors, I found myself surrounded by an elite crowd,
prominent local business figures, venture capitalists in tailored suits, and smiling members of Julian's extended family mingling near the bar. And right at the center of it all stood Julian himself. He looked every bit the triumphant, visionary tech founder, dressed in an impeccably fitted charcoal designer suit, a glass of vintage amber scotch cradled in his hand, holding court with a group of investors who hung on his every word. When he caught sight of me stepping onto the terrace, his face lit up with that trademark, dazzling smile that had once fooled me completely. He excused himself from the group, crossed the room with easy, confident strides, and greeted me with a warm, theatrical embrace, pressing a kiss to my cheek while the heavy scent of expensive cologne filled my senses. For the next hour, I watched him effortlessly charm the room, playing the gracious host and the brilliant entrepreneur who had pulled his company back from the absolute brink of destruction through sheer brilliance and unyielding grit. I stood quietly near the edge of the stone patio, sipping sparkling water, feeling a strange mixture of detachment and lingering pride as I watched him accept handshakes and backslaps from admirers. Near the end of the evening, as the string quartet paused and the clinking glassware quieted down, Julian stepped up to a small raised microphone stand at the front of the terrace, raising his crystal glass to command the attention of the entire room. His eyes swept across the crowd of investors, family members, and partners, glowing with a theatrical warmth, before locking directly onto me, standing near the glass railing. He smiled brightly, projecting his voice smoothly across the silent patio, thanking his partners, thanking his parents, and then turning the spotlight squarely in my direction. The air in my lungs suddenly felt heavy and suffocating as I heard the words he chose to broadcast to every single person in attendance, shattering the last illusion of trust I had left. And lastly, a very special acknowledgement to my incredible mother-in-law, Eleanor, a remarkable woman who believed in me when no one else would, and who so generously gifted us a $75,000 investment capital out of the blue to save my dream, expecting nothing back in return. The entire terrace erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause, with guests turning to nod and smile at me, whispering about how wonderfully generous a mother-in-law I was. The blood instantly drained from my face, rushing away from my fingers and leaving my hands freezing cold. The glass of sparkling water trembled violently against my knuckles, the tiny bubbles fizzing in mockery as the sound of the applause echoed like thunder in my ears. Every instinct honed over 35 years in emergency medicine screamed at me to step forward, grab the microphone, and expose the absolute lie hanging in the crisp night air. But decades of discipline, of holding my composure in sterile hospital corridors to keep a room from descending into chaos, took over. I did not shout. I did not drop my glass. Instead, bound by the desperate need to protect my family's dignity in front of strangers, I locked my jaw, forced a tight, rigid smile onto my lips, and gave a slow, mechanical nod to the applauding crowd. On the outside, I played the part of the beaming, generous matriarch taking her bow, but beneath that polite exterior, every single vein in my body felt as though it had frozen solid.
The applause died down as the string quartet resumed its quiet background melody, but the ringing in my ears only grew sharper. While the rest of the room surged forward to shake Julian's hand and bask in the radiant glow of his success, my feet felt glued to the marble floor. I knew I couldn't stand there smiling forever. I needed to find my daughter, Sarah. I wove my way through the crowded terrace, past groups of laughing investors and glowing television screens displaying the company logo, heading toward the quieter dessert and coffee lounge near the indoor banquet hall. And that was where I finally saw her. Sarah was sitting alone at a small, round corner table tucked beneath a cascading floral arrangement. She was staring blankly at a half-eaten slice of torte on a silver plate, completely detached from the glittering festivities surrounding her. As I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. Her face was drained of color, her eyes swollen and red-rimmed, and her shoulders trembling beneath her modest floral blouse. This was not the expression of a proud wife celebrating her husband's corporate triumph. This was the face of someone who had just survived a shipwreck and was still drowning in the wreckage. "Sarah," I whispered, kneeling beside her chair and gently placing my hand over her cold fingers. "Sweetheart, what is it? Are you feeling sick?" Sarah looked up, her lower lip violently quivering as fresh tears spilled over her lashes. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she gripped my hands so tightly her knuckles turned white, pulling me frantically away from the table toward a narrow, deserted side hallway that led away from the banquet rooms toward the service exits. We stepped into the dim, quiet corridor, completely shielded from the music and the laughter echoing from the patio. Before I could ask another question, Sarah buried her face in her hands and broke down into a shattered, uncontrollable sob, the kind of deep, chest-heaving crying that comes from absolute terror and betrayal. "Mom, I'm so sorry," she choked out, her voice breaking into pieces against my shoulder. "I didn't know. God help me, I swear on my life I didn't know he did this to you until 10 minutes ago when he bragged about it to his business partner right in front of me, laughing like it was some kind of brilliant joke." My blood ran cold, freezing every drop of warmth in my veins. "Sarah, what are you talking about? What did Julian do?" What she told me in that quiet hallway tore open a chasm beneath my feet that made the $75,000 I lost look like a minor inconvenience. Julian hadn't just targeted my retirement savings, he had systematically hollowed out my daughter's life from the inside out. For months, under the guise of managing their household financial portfolio and preparing for tax season, Julian had subjected Sarah to a relentless cycle of psychological manipulation. He had gaslit her into believing her memory was failing, convinced her that her daily anxiety was putting their family at risk, and pressured her into signing digital authorization documents without reading the fine print. Using those manipulated signatures, Julian had systematically drained $35,000 from Sarah's personal premarital savings account, money she had set aside independently long before she ever met him, intended as her ultimate safety net. When Sarah accidentally discovered the missing bank statements earlier that evening in their bedroom and confronted him before leaving for the gala, Julian hadn't even bothered to deny it. Instead, he had laughed in her face, brushed it off as smart business management, and coldly warned her that if she ever made a scene or ruined his big night in front of his investors, he would file for divorce and ensure she never saw full custody of Leo and Toby. Standing there in the dim hallway, listening to my daughter recount the calculated cruelty of the man we both had trusted, every lingering shred of doubt vanished entirely.
This wasn't a temporary cash flow crunch or an unfortunate startup failure. This was a calculated, predatory con artist who had weaponized our deepest love, our trust, and our family bonds as tools for systematic theft. The fierce, protective instincts of a mother and a veteran nurse collided inside my chest, forging an ice-cold resolve that far surpassed anger. I reached out, my hands steady once more, and gently wiped the wet tears from my daughter's pale cheeks. "Listen to me, Sarah," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, unwavering cadence that left no room for argument. "Do not let him see you cry. Do not say a single word to him tonight. Act normal, finish the evening, and let him think he has won. Don't do anything yet. Just let me handle this." Sarah looked up at me, blinking through her tears, and slowly nodded.
The emotional shockwaves of that night at the resort did not fade when I returned home. They sharpened into a cold, clinical clarity. For 3 days, I moved through my house in a quiet haze, replaying every word Sarah had whispered in the hallway. I kept the anger locked deep inside me, refusing to spill over. In my 35 years managing an intensive care unit, I learned early on that panic never saved a patient. Methodical precision did. You do not scream at a crashing monitor. You check the vitals, trace the source of the failure, and act with absolute composure. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday morning during a routine grocery run at the local market downtown. The aisles were quiet, smelling of damp earth and fresh produce, when a familiar voice called out my name near the bakery counter. "Eleanor? Eleanor Vance? Goodness gracious, it is you." I turned to see Arthur Sterling standing by the display shelves. Arthur was a retired chief financial officer who had spent 25 years managing budgets at St. Jude's before stepping down a few years before my own retirement. He looked older, leaning slightly on a wooden cane, but his eyes were as sharp and analytical as ever. We stepped aside near the window, exchanging pleasantries about our retired lives, until the conversation inevitably drifted toward family and the local business scene. With a slight frown, Arthur lowered his voice, glancing around the aisle as if sharing a confidential hospital chart. "Say, Eleanor, I heard through some mutual acquaintances that your son-in-law, Julian, just threw a lavish celebration for a big tech acquisition. But to be frank with you, it struck me as rather odd." My grip tightened slightly around the handle of my shopping basket. "Odd, Arthur? In what way?" Arthur shook his head, offering a grim, knowing look. "Well, word in the financial district travels fast. Back when I was still consulting, some associates in commercial lending looked into his startup. The truth is, Julian's check firm didn't just hit a sudden rough patch a few months ago. It legally went under and filed for bankruptcy nearly half a year prior, completely buried under heavy private credit debts and high-interest loans. There was never any major venture capital backing, and certainly no big tech acquisition waiting in Seattle. A company dissolved that thoroughly doesn't just bounce back overnight." Arthur's words hit me with the quiet, devastating force of a surgical scalpel. Every piece of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place, snapping together with terrifying precision. Julian hadn't been an ambitious entrepreneur fighting a sudden market downturn. He was a serial con artist whose entire existence was built on hollow smoke and mirrors. The frantic phone call about the missed payroll, the fabricated Uber shifts in the middle of the night, the dramatic tears, and the sacred oaths sworn on his son's lives, it had all been a meticulously rehearsed performance.
He hadn't used my $75,000 to save a dying startup. He used it to plug his personal debts, bail out his high-risk lifestyle, and buy himself time to hunt for his next set of victims. I thanked Arthur quietly, finished my errands, and drove straight back to my timber-framed house in the foothills. Once inside, I walked past the kitchen and headed straight to my small home office in the back. I sat down at my heavy wooden desk, switched on the brass reading lamp, and pulled open the bottom drawer. From it, I retrieved a thick, black, hardcover ledger, the kind I used to keep detailed shift logs back during my hospital days. Opening the crisp white pages, I picked up a black fountain pen. Gone was the mother who had wept in secret. In her place stood the veteran head nurse reviewing a complex trauma chart. With absolute methodical care, I began to document every single piece of evidence. I wrote down the exact date and time of Julian's phone call, the precise timestamp of the bank wire transfer for $75,000 from my personal savings account, and the account routing numbers. Next to that, I jotted down Sarah's harrowing testimony regarding the $35,000 drained from her premarital savings through digital gaslighting and manipulated signatures. I noted Arthur's statements regarding the bankruptcy timeline and the fake Seattle acquisition. I didn't reach for my phone. I didn't call Julian to scream, hurl insults, or demand explanations. Screaming at a predator only alerts them to cover their tracks. Instead, once every detail, receipt, and timeline was meticulously organized and cross-referenced in black ink, I closed the ledger with a soft, decisive click. I picked up my car keys, slid the heavy folder into my leather tote bag, and drove into downtown Portland. But I didn't drive to Julian's office, and I didn't drive to my daughter's house. I drove straight to the brick and glass office building of David Vance, a sharp, formidable senior attorney specializing in corporate fraud, civil litigation, and asset recovery.
2 weeks after my meeting with David Vance, the legal trap was finally set and fully primed. Julian, completely unaware that his house of cards was about to collapse, reached out with a grand invitation. He announced that he was hosting an exclusive, high-stakes private board meeting at his sleek downtown office suite to welcome a fresh group of wealthy angel investors. True to form, he insisted that our entire family attend, eager to parade us around as the quintessential picture of domestic bliss and stable family backing. Sarah, following my strict instructions to the letter, pasted on a fragile smile and agreed to go, while I quietly prepared myself for the final reckoning. On a crisp Friday afternoon, I stood inside the glass-walled conference room of Julian's office suite. The room was modern and sterile, smelling faintly of expensive leather and fresh printer paper. Around the long mahogany table sat three prominent venture capitalists, wealthy, sharp-eyed men in tailored suits who held checkbooks capable of breathing life into empty air. At the head of the table stood Julian. He looked radiant and utterly untouchable, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, a designer watch gleaming on his wrist as he gestured fluidly toward a digital presentation on the wall monitor, painting a breathtaking picture of exponential growth and guaranteed market dominance. Sarah sat quietly near the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale but composed. I sat directly across from her, my posture upright, my hands resting calmly on my leather portfolio. Julian beamed, pausing his presentation mid-sentence as the door behind him clicked open. A quiet hush fell over the room as a tall, professional man in a navy blue suit walked in. It wasn't a late-arriving investor or a caterer.
It was a senior clerk from David Vance's law firm carrying a thick, heavy manila folder embossed with an official legal seal. Without a word, the clerk walked straight to the head of the mahogany table and placed the heavy package right in front of Julian, right beside his sleek laptop. Julian blinked, momentarily caught off guard, before his trademark charisma surged right back to the surface. He let out a low, smooth chuckle, looking around the table at the investors with an air of theatrical amusement. "Ah, excellent timing," Julian announced loudly, flashing a bright, confident grin to his prospective backers. "Must be the final closing documents for our strategic partnership fund. Let's just open this right here, gentlemen, so you can see firsthand how efficiently our corporate logistics operate." Before anyone could intervene, Julian slipped his finger under the heavy red wax seal, tore the envelope open with practiced casualness, and pulled out the top document. He cleared his throat, unfolded the stiff white parchment, and looked down to read the header aloud to the room to showcase his triumph. The moment his eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the page, the color drained completely from his face. The easy, radiant smile froze on his lips, twisting into a mask of sudden, paralyzing horror. The papers in his hand began to shake violently, rustling loudly in the dead silence of the conference room. It wasn't a venture capital partnership agreement. It was a formal, multi-page legal demand letter for fraud, civil embezzlement, and financial deception, issued directly from the firm of Vance and Associates. Stunned into a momentary panic, Julian tried to stutter past the shock, attempting to laugh it off as some bizarre clerical error, but the documents laid out the brutal, undeniable truth in cold black and white. Stapled to the front was a certified copy of the bank wire transfer confirmation proving the transfer of $75,000 from my personal retirement account directly into his corporate ledger, complete with timestamps and audio transcribed voice confirmations of his fraudulent promises. Right beneath it lay Sarah's forensic financial audit, detailing the $35,000 systematically drained from her premarital savings through digital manipulation and forged authorization signatures. Before Julian could frantically push the papers aside, the final page of the dossier was exposed to the table, a public court record detailing his past corporate bankruptcy, outstanding credit defaults, and pending federal fraud investigations tied to his defunct shell companies. The silence in the conference room grew deafening. The lead venture capitalist sitting to my left slowly closed his leather briefcase with a sharp, echoing snap. He looked at Julian with eyes carved out of pure ice, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a razor. "It seems, Mr. Callahan, that your only real talent is inventing fairy tales," the investor said coldly, standing up from his chair. Without another word, the three investors stood in unison, pushed their chairs back against the polished floor, and walked out of the room without glancing back once. Julian stood frozen at the head of the table, clutching the legal documents as his carefully constructed empire of lies crumbled completely into dust. The collapse of Julian's meticulously crafted illusion did not take months or weeks. It unraveled entirely in less than 48 hours. By the time Monday morning rolled around, the shining digital image of the visionary tech founder had evaporated into thin air. The wealthy angel investors who had walked out of his conference room slammed the door shut on any future communications, blacklisting his name across the regional business network and notifying industry regulators. Casual acquaintances and fair-weather friends who once vied for his attention at high-end galas suddenly vanished into thin air. dodging his phone calls, ignoring his text messages, and crossing the street to avoid eye contact if they happened to cross paths downtown. Backed aggressively into a corner by the formal legal demands and forensic audits delivered by Vance and Associates, Julian found himself drowning in a rapidly rising tide of multi-layered liabilities, statutory fraud inquiries, corporate default penalties, and impending asset seizures that he could neither charm nor talk his way out of. With absolute legal protection, unwavering emotional backing, and strategic guidance provided by my attorney, Sarah officially filed for a fault-based divorce. She moved swiftly through the family court system to secure emergency temporary injunctions, freezing all remaining joint commercial entities, cutting off his access to shared lines of credit, and completely reclaiming full, independent control over her personal financial autonomy. For the first time in 5 agonizing years, my daughter's posture fundamentally changed. The permanent tension that had hollowed out her cheeks and carved deep, exhausted shadows beneath her eyes began to lift day by day, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve that reminded me precisely why she was my daughter. The physical departure came on a relentless, stormy Thursday night. The wind howled through the dense evergreens outside, lashing sheets of heavy rain against the window panes of Sarah's suburban home. When Sarah walked into the kitchen to make a late-night cup of tea, the house was dead silent, save for the rhythmic drumming of the storm. There was no confrontation, no screaming match, and no dramatic, tearful plea for forgiveness. Resting flat on the dark wood of the kitchen table was a single, crumpled piece of lined notebook paper. In hurried, jagged handwriting, Julian had left a cold farewell note, announcing that he was packing his remaining bags and leaving the city indefinitely to escape the mounting legal pressures, process servers, and crushing debts he could no longer outrun or manipulate. There was no tears shed in that kitchen, and there was no sense of tragic, lingering loss. As Sarah read the note and called me to let me know, the only emotion hanging in the air was a profound, weightless silence, the sudden, breathless quiet of a massive boulder finally being rolled off a suffocating chest. The parasite who had wormed his way into our lives had packed his bags and fled into the dark, leaving behind a shattered reputation and a messy trail of debris. But my daughter and my grandsons were finally, irrevocably safe. 3 weeks passed in relative tranquility as the legal dust began to settle across the board. Then, on a bright Tuesday morning, a thick, plain manila envelope dropped into my rural mailbox, bearing no return address, only my name written in neat, precise block letters. I carried it inside, sat down at my heavy wooden desk by the window, and carefully slit the top open with a steel letter opener. Inside was not a legal brief or a court summons, but a standard bank check drawn from a regional commercial account, made out cleanly in my name. The amount written across the front in crisp, dark ink was precisely $75,000. Every single penny of my retirement savings I had handed over on that cold autumn morning months ago. Tucked neatly behind it was a secondary cashier's check, covering the $35,000 drained from Sarah's premarital account, accompanied by a brief, unsigned settlement release form bearing Julian's unmistakable signature at the bottom. It wasn't an apology. There was no note of remorse, no confession of guilt, and no plea for mercy. It was simply a cold, unvarnished surrender. A white flag raised by a cornered con artist who realized that facing my attorney's mountain of irrefutable evidence in a federal courtroom would utterly destroy whatever was left of his miserable future. I looked down at the paper slip in my hand, feeling the last lingering knot of tension finally untangle from my chest. The armor I thought I had lost forever had found its way back home, earned not by blind trust, but by cold facts, unyielding preparation, and the unshakable resolve of a mother who refused to let her family fall apart. As I folded the checks and placed them back inside the envelope, I knew that the nightmare was finally over.
The morning air in Oregon carries the crisp, clean scent of melting frost and damp earth. It is spring, exactly 1 year since the storm that nearly dismantled everything I built. Standing by the front porch, I watch the pale morning sun stretch across the yard. The lavender beds lining the pathway, which looked withered and dead beneath months of heavy snow, are finally pushing through the dark soil, green and stubborn with new life. Out on the open lawn, the children are laughing, chasing each other through the damp grass with a carefree energy that still manages to catch me by surprise. Sarah sits beside me on the weathered wooden bench, a ceramic mug of hot tea cradled in her hands. We do not need to talk much anymore. Silence between us is no longer heavy with anxiety or unspoken fears. It has become a quiet sanctuary. On the kitchen counter inside, a simple white envelope sits sealed, containing the bank confirmation of the $75,000 successfully transferred back where it belongs, secured within an independent family savings fund. Yet, as I watch the steam rise from my tea, I know that the real victory was never about the numbers printed on a bank statement. The true awakening happened much deeper, in the quiet spaces of the soul where resilience is forged. I used to believe that keeping the peace meant swallowing my own voice, that a good heart had to be a silent target for everyone else's greed. That illusion shattered the day I stood my ground and looked past the victimhood straight into the core of the selfishness that sought to tear us apart. I remember the exact moment the air shifted between us, when the manipulation finally stripped away its polite mask. The memory of that sharp final confrontation still echoes faintly in the quiet corners of my mind. "You think you can just walk away with everything we built and call it a misunderstanding?" I asked, my voice steady, cutting through the silence like cold glass. "I was only trying to take care of what should have been mine all along," came the defiant, bitter reply, dripping with the same old entitlement. "No," I answered, looking straight into eyes that refused to see the damage left behind. "Kindness was never an invitation for you to steal my life, and you are about to learn the exact price of crossing that line." There was no room left for negotiation after that, just the sharp, undeniable snap of boundaries drawn in permanent ink. Looking up now, I take a slow, deep breath, letting the clean spring wind fill my chest. The blue sky stretches endlessly above the Oregon hills, clear and vast. I realize now that the deepest wounds we carry are often the most expensive tuition fees life requires us to pay. They do not break us permanently. Instead, they teach us how to stand entirely upright, supported by nothing other than our own recovered dignity. True family love is not a blind surrender to demands disguised as affection. It's a fierce, watchful protector that requires both an open heart and a sharp, unyielding mind. Trust is not something given away carelessly to fill the void. It's something earned, guarded, and built on mutual respect. As the children's laughter fades softly into the morning breeze, I finally let go of the last ghost of the past. The storm has passed, the ground is green again, and for the first time in a very long time, the house is truly at peace.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below, so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.